The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt about right. Nothing good ever came on a Tuesday. Marge Kellner found it tucked between a water bill and a coupon circular for a mattress store that had been going out of business for 3 years running. She almost missed it. The envelope was the color of old teeth, and the return address was printed in that particular font that HOAs and dental offices share. The one that says, "We are serious people doing serious things, and you should be afraid." She wasn't afraid. Not yet. Marge set the letter on the kitchen counter next to a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest grandma," a gift from her daughter's youngest, who had not yet learned to lie with any sophistication. She poured herself a second cup and stood there in the kitchen of the house she'd lived in for 31 years. The house where she'd raised 2 kids and buried a husband and replaced the roof twice. And she opened the envelope with her thumb the way she opened everything, tearing it crooked. The letter was from the Cedarbrook Estates Homeowners Association, Architectural Review Committee. It informed her that her property at 414 Sycamore Lane was in violation of Community Covenant Section 12.4b, regarding unapproved exterior modifications, and Section 8.7 EBA, regarding maintenance of visible property standards. The violations were described in language so dense it could have been used to insulate a wall. But what it boiled down to, once you scraped away the legal frosting, was this. The small raised garden bed she'd built along her front walkway was unauthorized, and the paint on her shutters had faded beyond acceptable parameters. The fine was $1,500. She had 30 days. Marge read it twice. Then she folded it back into the envelope and set it on the counter and drank her coffee and looked out the window at the garden bed in question. It was 4 feet by 8 feet, framed in cedar planks. Her husband, Gerald, had cut the spring before he died. She'd planted tomatoes in it that first year because Gerald always said you couldn't trust a tomato you hadn't grown yourself. Now it held marigolds and a few herbs and a small ceramic frog her granddaughter had painted at a birthday party. It was not an architectural statement. It was a garden bed. It was the last thing Gerald built. She washed her mug and set it in the rack and went outside to check the shutters. They were green. They had always been green. They were perhaps a slightly different green than they had been in 2019. Because that is what happens to paint when you leave it outside for 5 years in a state that gets both ice storms and 90-degree summers. She touched the wood. It was solid. The shutters were fine. Back inside, she sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a legal pad, the kind Gerald used to use when he was working through a problem. He'd been an engineer for the county for 26 years, roads and bridges mostly, and he approached everything the same way. Measure it, document it, think about it, then act. Marge had learned that from him the way you learn things from someone you sleep next to for decades. Not because they teach you, because it seeps in. She wrote down the date. She wrote down the violation numbers. She wrote down the fine amount. Then she wrote down a question that she underlined twice. Who filed the complaint? Because here was the thing about Cedarbrook Estates. It was 47 homes on quiet streets named after trees that didn't actually grow there. Marge knew every single household. She knew who mulched and who didn't. She knew whose dogs barked and whose teenagers drove too fast. She knew the rhythms of the place the way you know your own breathing. And she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had been paying attention for 31 years, that this letter had nothing to do with shutters or garden beds. This was about something else entirely. The first time Marge Kellerman knocked on Dale Presswood's door, she brought a clipboard and a tape measure and a smile that didn't reach past her teeth. This was 11 days after Dale had buried his wife. The ashes were still on the mantel in a box he hadn't picked out because the funeral home only had 3 options, and his daughter had chosen for him while he sat in the lobby staring at a ficus tree that needed water. Dale opened the door because he'd been raised to open doors. He was 67 years old, and he'd lived in the Briarwood Crossing subdivision for 19 of those years, and in all that time, nobody from the Homeowners Association had ever come to his front porch. Not once. Not when Linda was alive and kept the flower beds like something out of a calendar. Not when he'd replaced the roof on his own dime with the exact approved color from the exact approved vendor list. 19 years of quiet compliance, and the first time anyone showed up with a clipboard was 11 days after the worst thing that had ever happened to him. She introduced herself as the new HOA compliance officer. He didn't know they had one. She said the position had been created at the last quarterly board meeting. He hadn't attended the last quarterly meeting because Linda had been in the hospital, and the meeting was about parking regulations, and he'd had to choose between the two, and it hadn't been a choice at all. Marge Kellerman told him his mailbox post was 3 inches out of plumb. She told him his front lawn had a bare patch near the sidewalk that exceeded the allowable percentage of exposed soil. She told him his rain gutters showed visible oxidation. She told him all of this while holding the clipboard against her chest like a shield. And she told him he had 30 days to remedy each violation, or the fines would begin. Dale said thank you, and closed the door and sat down in Linda's chair, which he'd started sitting in because it smelled like her lotion, and he looked at the 3 envelopes she'd left him, and he put them on the kitchen counter next to a casserole dish. Someone from church had dropped off that he hadn't touched. He might have fixed everything. That's the thing people don't understand when they hear this story later. Dale Presswood was not a man who picked fights. He'd worked 31 years at the municipal water treatment plant, and he'd never filed a grievance, and he'd never missed a shift. And when he retired, they gave him a watch that still kept perfect time. He was the kind of man who would have gone out there with a level and a bag of grass seed and a wire brush and taken care of every single item on that list. Not because he agreed with it, but because compliance was easier than conflict, and he was tired in a way that went past his bones. But then Marge Kellerman came back, 9 days later. Before the 30-day window had closed, she came back with a different clipboard and a man Dale had never seen before who was taking photographs of his house from the sidewalk. And this time, the violations were different. A hairline crack in the driveway concrete, a discoloration on the garage door. The house numbers on his porch post were a 1/4 inch below the minimum required height. Dale stood on his porch in his slippers and watched this stranger photograph his home. And he felt something move in his chest that wasn't grief. It was adjacent to grief. It lived in the same neighborhood, but it was a different thing entirely, and it had been sleeping for a very long time. He didn't say anything to Marge Kellerman. He took the new envelopes and he nodded, and he closed the door. But that evening he did something he hadn't done since before Linda got sick. He went down to the basement and he opened the filing cabinet and he started to read. The thing about old houses is they keep secrets the way old people do, not out of malice, but out of habit. You live somewhere long enough, you stop noticing what's underneath. Margaret Calloway had lived at 414 Sycamore for 31 years and never once pulled up the linoleum in the kitchen. Why would she? It was ugly but functional, same as most things that lasted. It was Dale Presswood who made her look. Dale had been president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association for 6 years by then, and in that time he'd fined Margaret 11 times. 11 for a crooked mailbox post, for a garden hose left visible on a Tuesday, for the particular shade of beige she'd painted her shutters, which Dale said was warm sand, when the approved palette clearly specified desert khaki. Margaret had paid every fine because Margaret was the kind of woman who believed that if you followed the rules would eventually protect you. Then Dale sent the letter about her foundation. The letter said a concerned neighbor had reported visible cracking along the south-facing exterior wall of her home. The letter said this constituted a structural hazard and a violation of Section 14.3 of the Community Covenant regarding property maintenance standards. The letter said she had 45 days to commission a licensed inspection and submit a remediation plan to the Architectural Review Committee, or the association would begin levying daily fines of $75. Margaret was 72 years old. She was on a fixed income. She had buried her husband in that house, raised 2 daughters in that house, and regrouted the bathroom tile in that house with her own 2 hands when she was 68, because the quote from the contractor was more than her monthly Social Security check. She called her daughter Elaine, who lived 40 minutes away in Crestwood, and worked as a paralegal for a firm that mostly handled slip and fall cases. Elaine came over on a Saturday with coffee and a legal pad, and they sat at the kitchen table, and Elaine said, "Mum, show me every piece of paper they've ever sent you." Margaret pulled a shoebox from the hall closet, then another shoebox, then a manila folder, then a grocery bag. Elaine spread it all out on the kitchen floor because the table wasn't big enough. She got on her hands and knees and started sorting by date, and that's when she felt it. A soft spot near the baseboard by the stove. Not rot exactly. More like give, like the floor remembered something heavy that used to sit there and had never quite recovered. "Mum, what's under this linoleum?" "The original hardwood, I think. Your father always said so." Elaine peeled back the corner. Underneath was oak, dark with age but solid, and tucked between 2 planks, folded into a space no wider than a pencil, was a piece of paper so old it had gone the color of weak tea. It was the original community covenant. Not the one Dale cited in his letters. Not the amended version from 2011 that the current board had ratified in a meeting Margaret hadn't been notified about. The original from 1987, signed by the developer, the first board, and, in careful cursive near the bottom, Robert and Margaret Calloway. Elaine read it twice. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at her mother with an expression Margaret hadn't seen since Elaine was 9 years old, and had just figured out how the magic trick worked. "Mom," she said, "half the things they find you for aren't in here. They're not even close." Margaret looked at the shoebox, the grocery bag, the 11 fines, the letter about her foundation. She looked at the piece of paper in her daughter's hand. She thought about Dale Presswood, and his desert khaki, and his 45 days. "Well," she said. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold, but she drank it anyway. "I suppose we should make copies." The thing about Marjorie Kessler's fence is that it told a story if you knew how to read it. Every ding, every replaced slat, every coat of paint that didn't quite match the one before it. Those were words. And the HOA had been writing on that fence for 11 years. I know because I helped her replace the 3rd slat from the left on the south side back in 2019. She'd come home from her shift at the hospital to find a notice zip-tied to her mailbox saying the slat was warped. It wasn't warped. I looked at it with a level. But Marjorie didn't argue. She just bought a new slat, and I helped her nail it in on a Sunday morning while her coffee went cold on the porch railing. That's the thing people don't understand about someone like Marjorie. They see the quiet, and they think it means she doesn't notice. They see the compliance, and they think it means she agrees. 11 years of violation notices. 11 years of fines that started at $25 and crept up to $75, then $100, then $250 for what they called repeated non-compliance. The grass was too long. The grass was too short. The mailbox post needed repainting. The repainting was the wrong shade of approved cream. Her garbage cans were visible from the street for 14 minutes on a Tuesday because she got held over at work and couldn't wheel them back behind the gate by the 6 p.m. cutoff. 14 minutes. They had a time-stamped photo. Now, I've lived on Sycamore Court for going on 20 years, and I can tell you that Dale Purcell across the street left his cans out overnight more times than I can count, and never once got a letter. But Dale was on the Architectural Review Committee. Dale played poker with Stu Brannigan, who was board president from 2014 to 2022. Dale's house was the same square footage as Marjorie's, on the same street, with the same builder-grade siding, and Dale's house was never once photographed at an angle designed to make it look like a problem. Marjorie's file with the HOA was 4 inches thick. I know this because she showed it to me the evening everything changed, sitting at her kitchen table with the whole thing organized in a binder with tab dividers. Every notice, every fine, every payment receipt, every photo they'd sent her, and every photo she'd taken in response. Dates, times, weather conditions. She had a composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind, where she'd logged every interaction with the board going back to her 2nd year in the house. She hadn't been enduring it. She'd been documenting it. There's a difference that people like Stu Brannigan never learn until it's too late. They think silence is the same as surrender. They think a woman who pays her fines without complaint is a woman who has accepted the terms. But Marjorie was a nurse. She'd spent 30 years charting, noting times, recording vitals, writing down exactly what she observed in language that was precise and clinical and would hold up under any kind of review. That wasn't just a habit. It was a fluency. She turned to a page near the back of the binder and slid it across the table to me. It was a spreadsheet she'd built by hand on graph paper, columns tight and neat. Every homeowner on Sycamore Court, every violation issued in the last 5 years, pulled from the HOA's own published meeting minutes. The pattern was so clean it almost didn't need explaining, but Marjorie explained it anyway, running her finger down the column of addresses, tapping twice on the empty rows. 6 houses had received 80% of all violations. I won't tell you what those 6 houses had in common, because you already know. She looked at me over the top of her reading glasses and said the first thing I ever heard her say that sounded like it had an edge to it. I'm ready now. The Talmadge Creek runs behind the houses on Orchard Lane like it's been holding its breath for 40 years. Most folks don't think about it. It's just the creek, the thing their kids throw sticks into, the reason the backyards stay muddy in April. But Dottie Halverson thought about it every single day, because Dottie Halverson had been on the Drainage Committee in 1986 when the HOA voted to reroute the culvert, and she kept every document from that vote in a fireproof lockbox under her guest bed. This matters because of what Glenn Toomey tried to do at the emergency session. He stood up at that folding table they always set up in the community room at Faith Lutheran, and he said the drainage easement had never been formally recorded. Said it with the confidence of a man who had never once considered that someone might check. He had his little laptop open, and he turned it around to show a county GIS map that, sure enough, showed no easement annotation along the south bank where Mora's property line met the creek. Without a recorded easement, Glenn said, the association has full authority to assess remediation costs to the adjacent property owner. He looked right at Mora when he said it. Didn't even pretend otherwise. Now here is where you need to understand something about how these things actually work. An HOA board can say almost anything in a meeting. They can say the moon is a balloon. The power isn't in what they say. The power is in what gets written into the minutes and then mailed to homeowners who don't attend. Most people get that envelope, glance at it, and throw it away. That's the whole game. That's how Glenn had been running things for 11 years. He said things in rooms. Those things became minutes. Those minutes became precedent, and precedent became policy. It's a magic trick that only works if nobody's watching. Dottie was watching. She didn't stand up right away. She let Glenn finish his whole presentation, all 12 minutes of it, including the part where he suggested a special assessment of $4,200 against Mora's lot for what he called unauthorized drainage impact. She let him close his laptop. She let him ask if there were any questions. Then she raised her hand like she was asking permission to use the restroom. I have the original easement filing, she said, signed by the board president in 1986, recorded with the county clerk on November 14th of that year, instrument number 86-4471. I also have the minutes from the Drainage Committee meeting where the reroute was approved, which show the association accepted maintenance responsibility in perpetuity. She paused. I brought copies. She had 43 copies, one for every occupied household in the association. She'd made them at the FedEx on Route 9 that morning, and she'd paid for them herself, $7.40, which she would later submit as a reimbursement request that Glenn would have to approve because it qualified as a committee expense under Article 4, Section 3. The room got very quiet. Not the dramatic kind of quiet you see in movies, the real kind. The kind where people are looking at their hands and recalculating what they thought they knew. Glenn said the document would need to be verified. Dottie said she'd already contacted the county clerk's office and they confirmed the recording. She had the confirmation email on her phone. She held it up. She didn't walk it over to him. She just held it up from her seat. Arms straight, the way you'd hold up a bus pass. Maura told me later that she watched Glenn's face during those 15 seconds and what she saw wasn't anger. It was the look of a man who had just realized the floor he was standing on had been hollow the whole time. That, all of it, every resolution, every assessment, every letter he'd sent on association letterhead, could be opened back up and examined by someone with a fireproof lockbox and a FedEx receipt. The special assessment was tabled. It has not come back. The thing about glass is, you never hear it start to crack. You hear it finish. You hear the give, the shatter, the scatter across tile. But the fracture itself, the first thin line working its way through, that happens in silence. Margaret Ellison found the first fracture on a Tuesday. Not in glass, in paper. She'd been going through the minutes from the last 3 years of board meetings, the ones Dale Hutchins had finally surrendered after the state compliance office sent their second letter. Not their first, their second. Because Dale had ignored the first one, the way he ignored everything that didn't serve him, with a kind of practiced deafness that he'd turned into an art form. The minutes were typed clean. Too clean, actually, for meetings that Margaret had attended and remembered as messy, contentious, full of people talking over each other about fence heights and drainage easements, and whether the Pham family's basketball hoop was regulation distance from the sidewalk. In the typed version, every vote was unanimous, every motion seconded promptly, every concern addressed and resolved within the same paragraph. Margaret knew better. She'd been at the meeting in April of the previous year when Cora Briggs had stood up and asked where the special assessment money had gone. The $11,000 collected for the retention pond repair that still hadn't been repaired. In the minutes, that moment didn't exist. Cora's name appeared nowhere. The retention pond appeared once, in a line that read, "Retention pond maintenance ongoing. No further action required." Margaret set that page aside. Then she found another. Then another. By Thursday, she had 14 pages spread across her kitchen table, each one marked with a yellow sticky note, each note bearing a single word or phrase in Margaret's careful handwriting. Fabricated. No vote taken. Meeting never occurred. Cora spoke here. Removed. She called Randall. Randall Owens had been the one to file the original complaint, back when this was still just about his shed and the $200 a day fine that Dale had invented out of whole cloth. Randall's shed was up to code. Randall had the permits. Randall had the county inspector's sign-off framed on his workshop wall because he was that kind of man. The kind who keeps receipts not out of paranoia, but out of a bone-deep respect for doing things right. When Margaret told him what she'd found, Randall was quiet for a long time. Not surprised quiet, tired quiet. The quiet of a man who had suspected the floor was rotten and had just been told how deep the rot went. "How many meetings?" he asked. "At least 9 that I can confirm were altered. 3 that I don't think happened at all. 3 whole meetings that didn't happen. The votes from those meetings authorized the fine schedule. Your fine schedule, Randall, and the Pham's, and that lien they put on Doreen's property." Another silence. Then Randall said something that Margaret would remember for a long time, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. So none of it was real. None of it was real. Not the authority behind the fines, not the votes that created them, not the board actions that Dale had wielded like a man swinging a hammer at people who couldn't swing back. The whole structure, the letters, the threats, the liens, the late fees compounding on late fees, all of it rested on minutes from meetings that were either falsified or fictional. Margaret made copies. She made copies of the copies. She drove one set to Randall's house and another to the attorney Cora's daughter had found, the one who worked out of the converted duplex on Greenway and who had looked at their situation with the calm, unsurprised expression of someone who had seen this exact thing before. The fracture was in the glass now, silent still, but spreading. Dale didn't know yet. He would. The field behind Murren's property hadn't been mowed since Gerald died, and by the time the HOA sent their third violation notice, the grass stood waist-high and full of milkweed. Butterflies loved it. The board did not. What the board loved was leverage, and a field of tall grass on a corner lot was exactly the kind of thing Donna Pruitt could photograph from 6 angles and attach to a formal complaint, which she did, 3 times. Each letter more threatening than the last, each one citing a different subsection of the covenants, as if cycling through ammunition to see what would finally make Maren flinch. Maren did not flinch. Maren had spent 4 decades married to a man who read every document he ever signed, and Gerald had taught her the one thing Donna never expected a 72-year-old widow to know: how to read a covenant like a contract, not a commandment. The 4th letter came certified. It informed Maren that the board had voted to authorize a contractor to mow the field at her expense, billing her account directly, and that continued non-compliance would result in a lien on her property. The letter was signed by Donna as president, Keith Vanderberg as treasurer, and Lyle Mosk as secretary. 3 signatures, a quorum of 3 on a 5-member board. Maren sat on her porch with that letter and a glass of iced tea and called her neighbor Roy, who had been Gerald's fishing partner for 19 years and who happened to have retired from the county recorder's office. Roy came over. Roy read the letter. Roy said one word. "Huh." Then he asked to see the original covenants, not the summary the board mailed to new homeowners. Not the amended bylaws Donna had drafted herself in 2019. The original recorded covenants from 1987, which Gerald had kept in a fireproof box under the bedroom floor, along with their marriage certificate and the deed to the house. Roy spread the pages across the kitchen table and put on his reading glasses and didn't say anything for 20 minutes. Maren refilled his tea. She had learned from Gerald that you don't rush a man who's reading something that matters. When Roy looked up, he had the expression of someone who has found exactly what he suspected. The original covenants defined the board as 7 members, not 5. They required a supermajority of 5 votes for any action involving liens or property charges. Donna's 2019 amendment reducing the board to 5 members had never been recorded with the county. It had been voted on at a meeting where only 11 homeowners were present out of 46, and the covenants required a 2/3 homeowner vote for structural amendments. The amendment was void. The board was operating under an illegitimate structure. Every lien, every forced contractor billing, every fine levied since 2019 had been authorized by a body that did not legally exist in the form it claimed. Roy wrote all of this down on a yellow legal pad in his careful retired clerk handwriting. Maren photocopied everything. Then she did something Donna never would have predicted, because Donna had always assumed that quiet people were passive people. Maren drove to every house in the neighborhood, all 46. She brought the documentation in a manila folder, and she explained it on each porch the way Gerald would have, plainly and without malice, letting the facts do the work. It took her 3 days. She wore her good walking shoes and brought a water bottle. And she did not skip a single house, including Lyle Mosque's, where his wife Linda answered the door and listened with a face that went from confused to furious in the space of about 90 seconds. By the following Tuesday, 31 homeowners had signed a petition for a special meeting. By Thursday, Donna had received a formal demand to open the books. By the weekend, she had hired a lawyer, which told everyone in the neighborhood exactly what they needed to know. The field still stood tall and full of monarchs. Maren watered her tomatoes and waited. The drive back from the county building took 40 minutes, and for most of it, neither of us said a word. Margaret kept her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, the way she always did, and I watched the strip malls give way to the older neighborhoods, the ones with the big oaks that nobody had gotten around to trimming because nobody had sent them a violation letter yet. The folder sat on my lap, 37 pages. Every resolution, every finding, every corrective action the board had voted on that afternoon with their faces the color of old milk. I didn't need to open it again. I'd read it twice in the parking lot while Margaret sat on the hood of the car and ate a granola bar like it was any other Tuesday. That's the thing about winning something like this. You expect fireworks. You expect the moment to feel like the moment. But mostly it feels like putting down a suitcase you forgot you were carrying until your shoulder started to ache. Gerald Pemberton resigned. That was in the folder. Effective immediately, which in HOA language means he didn't want to sit through the part where they read the findings out loud. Brenda Koss and Tom Whitfield stayed, but they'd been reassigned to the Architectural Review Subcommittee, which was about as toothless as you could get without dissolving the position entirely. The new interim board president was a woman named Diane Okafor, who'd moved into the Sycamore section 3 years ago and who I'd seen exactly once at the summer block party, where she'd brought potato salad and asked intelligent questions about the drainage easement. The fines were rescinded. All of them. Every single one going back to the first letter about Ruth's garden shed, which had been up for 11 years before anyone decided it was a problem. The lien was dissolved. The legal fees, and this was the part that made Margaret pull over and put her forehead on the steering wheel for a full minute. The legal fees were to be reimbursed from the association's operating budget, which meant Gerald's little campaign had cost every homeowner in Briarwood Crossing about $47 apiece. I imagined that number showing up in the next quarterly statement. I imagined the questions at the next open meeting. Some corrections are administrative, some are social. The $47 was going to do work that no resolution ever could. We pulled into the driveway and Margaret turned off the engine, and we sat there looking at Ruth's house next door, the garden shed, the rose trellis along the side fence that had started this whole thing, or at least had been the excuse for starting it. The porch light was on even though it was the middle of the afternoon, because Ruth always left it on. She said a lit porch was a promise that someone was home. I thought about what Ed Chen had said at the hearing, when he'd stood up during the public comment period and spoken for maybe 90 seconds total. He didn't talk about the bylaws or the enforcement procedures or any of it. He talked about the year his wife was sick, and Ruth brought soup every single day for 4 months, and never once asked how things were going because she could see how things were going. And she knew that the asking was sometimes the heaviest part. That was when the board members stopped looking at their papers and started looking at each other. We brought the folder over to Ruth's. She read the first page, set it down on the kitchen table, and put the kettle on. We sat in her kitchen and drank tea that was too weak because she always took the bags out too early. And we talked about the weather and Margaret's tomatoes, and whether the county was ever going to fix the pothole on Archer Road. She never said thank you. She didn't need to. The porch light was on, and we were sitting in her kitchen and the tea was terrible, and that was enough. That was always going to be enough.